Single-father mechanic fixes billionaire vintage plane, unaware it will change his children's future. Most people drive past forgotten places without a second glance. Cracked pavement, rusted locks, buildings sagging under the weight of years. They don't stop, they don't wonder. But Joseph Cole had a habit of noticing what others ignored, and on a cold Tuesday morning in October, that habit changed everything. The text had come at 6:14 a.m. from Wayne Larrabee, the old airport groundskeeper. "Got something you might want to see? Hunger 3. Bring a flashlight." Joseph nearly deleted it, thinking it was a wrong number. He hadn't spoken to Wayne in months, but something about it tugged at his gut. Maybe it was the timing, or the fact that Hangar 3 had been padlocked since before Joseph moved to Elridge. Either way, an hour later he was standing in front of it, breath steaming in the air, key in hand, a crowbar in the other, because he knew nothing ever opened cleanly when it had been forgotten for 30 years. The lock snapped with a groan like it hadn't moved since cassette tapes were still a thing. The heavy sliding doors scraped along the concrete, stubborn at first, then giving way with a reluctant lurch. The smell hit him first. Dust, oil, a strange metallic stillness that made the space feel preserved, not abandoned. And then he saw it. A shape beneath tarps, easily 30 feet across, tucked into the far end of the cavernous hangar like a sleeping animal. Not a crop duster, not the beat-up Cessnas he was used to servicing in his small shop off County Road 6. This thing had presence, purpose, the kind of design that didn't just fly, it dreamed. Joseph's boots echoed as he crossed the floor, pulling back the layers one by one. Each reveal brought something unexpected. The wing curves were sharper, cleaner, the rivets flush set and gleaming under years of grime. Whoever built this plane didn't just understand aerodynamics, they had elevated it to art. By the time he'd uncovered the nose, Joseph knew two things with absolute certainty. This was no ordinary aircraft, and it didn't belong in a forgotten hangar on the edge of a dying town. He stepped back, heart hammering, the silence of the space so thick it felt sacred. The plane, if it could even be called that, was sleek, streamlined, and unlike anything he'd worked on. No registration, no serial markings, just the faintest outline of an emblem under the dust. For a moment, Joseph stood frozen, unsure whether to be excited or terrified, because whatever this was, it was valuable, rare, possibly priceless, and his life, already balancing on the edge, was about to shift completely. For the past 4 years, he had been running on fumes, emotionally, financially, and in every other way that mattered. After losing his wife, Ellie, in a car crash, it had been just him and the kids. Mason was 13 now, brilliant with numbers, but quick to shut down when things got emotional. Lily was 15, a quiet fixer who'd rather rebuild a carburetor than go to homecoming. Joseph's repair shop had scraped by on loyalty from locals and the occasional float plane that wandered in for service. But business had dried up, the bank was circling, and just last week he'd found himself staring at his empty checking account, wondering whether to pay the mortgage or stock the fridge. But now, this was something else. He ran his hand along the fuselage, fingertips tracing the outline of a hatch sealed with custom bolts. He didn't know what he was looking at yet, not really, but instincts he hadn't felt in years kicked in like muscle memory. He knew aircraft, he knew metal, he knew how to listen to what machines were trying to say, and this machine, this beautiful, mysterious relic, was whispering one thing loud and clear: I matter. And maybe, just maybe, if he listened closely enough, it could change everything. Joseph didn't tell the kids right away, not because he didn't want to. He always tried to include them in whatever scraps of good news life threw their way, but because he needed to be sure it wasn't just another false spark in a life filled with dead batteries. Sure it wasn't just another derelict plane forgotten for good reason. That night, long after the sun had disappeared behind the horizon and the kids had vanished into the familiar ritual of homework, music, and avoidance of chores, Joseph sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table Ellie had once set with chipped blue plates and fresh cornbread, staring at the printed photos he'd taken on his phone. Each image he zoomed into told the same story: handcrafted components, advanced engineering, odd choices that didn't line up with any blueprint he'd seen before. He cross-referenced the tail design, tried searching the emblem. No results. That was strange. No results usually meant two things. Either it was so common that it wasn't worth indexing, or it was so rare no one had ever documented it. He was betting on the second. The following morning, Joseph dropped Lily and Mason off at school like always, masking his exhaustion with a quick joke and a promise of pancakes for dinner, but even Mason noticed something was off. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, as he unbuckled his seatbelt, eyebrows scrunched in that way Joseph had seen since he was 4. Joseph gave him a reassuring nod. "Just thinking about a project," he said. That part was true. What he didn't say was that he hadn't slept more than an hour. His mind was spinning, full of schematics that didn't exist and questions that didn't have answers. He drove straight to the hangar as soon as the school bell swallowed up his kids. This time, he brought his tools. The more he opened, the more amazed he became. Inside the engine compartment was a power plant like nothing he'd serviced before. Custom manifolds, cylinders positioned in a way that suggested experimental airflow optimization. And it wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. Designed with purpose, yes, but also with soul. Someone had cared deeply about this machine. Someone had envisioned not just performance, but legacy. The deeper Joseph dug, the more he saw evidence of choices that defied the time period. This plane, if he was right, was decades ahead of its era. It was as if whoever built it had seen the future and tried to bring it back in riveted aluminum and precision-welded steel. By noon, Joseph sat back on the concrete floor, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had once been a dish towel, completely overwhelmed, not by what he'd found, but by what it might mean. The shop was barely hanging on. He'd maxed out his last credit card paying the electric bill. He hadn't told the kids yet, but the mortgage company had sent the final notice. 30 days. Then it was foreclosure and the end of Cole Aviation Repairs. The end of their home. The end of everything Ellie had fought so hard to build alongside him. And now somehow, sitting in front of him was a machine that might, just might, be worth enough to change all that. Maybe it was wishful thinking. Maybe it was desperation. But Joseph didn't believe in coincidences anymore. He believed in timing. And this aircraft, hidden in a forgotten hangar just weeks before his world was due to collapse, felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a second chance wrapped in aluminum and dust. That night, over pancakes burned slightly on one side and syrup that was mostly corn syrup from the dollar store, Joseph finally told them. "I found something," he said, trying to sound casual as he poured coffee into a chipped mug. "Something at the airport." Lily looked up from her plate, curious. "Another Cessna?" she asked, almost hopefully. She liked the small planes, loved their guts and squeaks and quirks. Mason didn't look up from his tablet, but his ears perked. Joseph shook his head. "Number something, different." He told them what he could, the hangar, the aircraft, the strange engine, the craftsmanship. He left out the part about how bad the finances were. He left out the part about the mortgage. He didn't want panic in their eyes. He just wanted them to be curious, the way he'd been. And they were. Mason, despite himself, started asking questions. What kind of engine? What configuration? Lily, already more emotionally invested than either of them, said what Joseph hadn't dared to voice aloud. Could it be worth something? Joseph leaned back in his chair, exhausted but smiling. "That's what I want to find out." And as he looked across the table at the two kids who had survived more than their share of loss and who still managed to show up for life every single day, he made a decision he hadn't known he'd been avoiding. He would restore the plane, even if it took every last dime, even if he had to work double shifts and borrow tools he couldn't afford to replace, even if he failed. Because if there was even a chance that this aircraft could change their future, then it was worth everything he had left to give. It started with a checklist. Joseph scribbled it onto the back of a grocery receipt one morning before sunrise, still running on nothing but coffee and hope. The note was simple: lights, tarps, hand tools, wire brush, camera, gloves, extra hands. The last part, extra hands, was underlined twice. He'd tried tackling it solo, but this wasn't a one-man job anymore. Not if he wanted to do more than admire the mystery. He needed help. And there were only two people in his life he trusted with something this fragile, this important. Whether they were ready or not, Lily and Mason were about to become part of the project. He picked them up from school that afternoon with a strange energy buzzing beneath his usual dad jokes. They noticed. Lily caught it first. She always did. "You're excited," she said, narrowing her eyes in mock suspicion. "What are we doing?" Mason groaned from the back seat, backpack still half-zipped. "If it's another mystery carburetor rebuild, I'm out. I still have grease under my fingernails from last time." Joseph didn't answer right away. He just smiled and turned the truck down the long gravel road toward the airfield. "You'll see." When they arrived at Hangar 3, Joseph didn't bother with a speech. He didn't need to. As soon as the doors creaked open and sunlight flooded across the plane's metallic skin, both kids fell silent. Lily was the first to move, walking up to the uncovered wing with a reverence usually reserved for museum exhibits. She reached out to touch the surface, then pulled her hand back like she was afraid it might vanish. "Dad," she whispered, It's beautiful." Mason wasn't as verbal, but his eyes were wide behind his thick glasses. He circled the plane slowly, phone already out, snapping photos from every angle. He knelt near the landing gear, studying the retractable system, then glanced up with the first genuine smile Joseph had seen from him in weeks. Whoever built this, they were way ahead of their time. They got to work immediately. Joseph assigned tasks without needing to explain much. Lily took charge of the cleaning. She was meticulous, the kind of person who wouldn't move to the next section until every inch of the last one was spotless. She worked in silence, sponge and wire brush in hand, stripping away years of grime like she was uncovering a buried treasure. Mason created a catalog on his tablet, labeling parts, taking measurements, noting damage. He started cross-referencing components with old aircraft designs online, muttering to himself as he tapped through archived blueprints and engineering forums. And Joseph? He floated between them, checking on progress, helping where needed, stepping back just long enough to realize something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Pride. This wasn't just a family cleanup job. This was a team. The three of them, father, daughter, and son, working side by side not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they believed in what they were doing. Hours passed without any of them checking the time. Lily climbed into the cockpit and let out a soft whistle. "Dad, the instrumentation is insane. Look at this panel. Half of it's custom. And this switch configuration, I've never seen anything like it." Joseph climbed up beside her and squinted. She was right. The layout was both familiar and alien, as if designed by someone who had studied every aircraft made until 1948 and then decided to break every rule carefully. Mason called out from the nose, "Guys, get over here, you've got to see this." He pointed to a brass plate bolted just beneath the fuselage, barely visible through a crust of rust and dirt. Joseph knelt beside him and cleaned it gently with a rag. The engraving was faint but unmistakable. Built for the sky, grounded by love. CM1948. That was the moment the story shifted from restoration to mystery. CM, those initials could belong to anyone, but something about the date, the wording, and the care that had gone into the design, it all suggested this wasn't just a backyard experiment. Whoever CM was, he had built this plane for something bigger than a weekend flight, and then he'd hidden it, or lost it, or never came back for it. Joseph didn't say any of that aloud. He didn't need to. The kids felt it too. The energy in the hangar changed. The project had gone from a potential payday to something more, something almost sacred. As dusk fell, they finally stepped back to admire their progress. The plane still wasn't flyable, not even close, but it looked less like a relic and more like a sleeping legend. Joseph put a hand on Mason's shoulder, then ruffled Lily's hair. "We don't know what this is yet," he said, voice low, "but I have a feeling it's going to change everything." Neither child laughed. Neither rolled their eyes. They simply nodded, because they believed him. Back at home, as Joseph made grilled cheese and tomato soup from cans, the kids pored over what they'd collected. Lily had drawn diagrams on scrap paper. Mason had created a shared folder of historical references, including one obscure mention of a Charles Mayfield, an aircraft engineer who disappeared during a test flight in the late 40s. The timelines didn't match perfectly, but the details were enough to make Joseph's heart beat a little faster. Later, after the dishes were stacked and the lights dimmed, Joseph lingered at the table. He watched his kids, laughing, brainstorming, already planning their next trip to the hangar, and realized he hadn't seen them this alive in months, maybe years. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight of bills and banks and broken things lifted. They weren't fixing an aircraft. They were fixing something far more important, each other. The first call Joseph made was to someone who owed him nothing, but had never let him down. Owen Redmond had been a mechanic, a test pilot, and a loner in equal measure. He'd worked out of a hangar in Minot for years before retiring, living out his days building model gliders and listening to AM radio stations that faded in and out with the wind. Joseph hadn't spoken to him since Ellie's funeral, but when he called and explained briefly and carefully what he'd found, Owen didn't hesitate. "I'll be there by Friday," he said. "Don't touch that engine till I've seen it with my own eyes." And so began the next phase of the restoration, gathering allies. Joseph needed more than tools and ambition now. He needed knowledge, verification, and, if his gut was right, discretion. Because what they were working on didn't just look rare. It felt rare, like something that had slipped through the cracks of history. And if that was true, then digging too loudly could bring attention they weren't ready for. The week leading up to Owen's arrival was a blur of preparation. Lily continued cleaning, becoming territorial over the aircraft's interior like it was her room. She even started leaving her gloves in the cockpit, daring anyone else to clean the gauges. "You touch my dials, you die," she joked, only half joking. Mason built out a makeshift database in his spare time, tracking every part, every marking, every anomaly. He began finding inconsistencies that only deepened the mystery. Gauges marked in metric and imperial, insulation materials that weren't standard until the 1960s, and a flight stick style common in military designs but never used commercially. Joseph worked from dawn till well past dark, balancing the shop's few remaining customer jobs while sneaking off to the hangar every spare minute. He didn't have the luxury of a full sabbatical. The mortgage was still due. The shop needed to look like it was still functioning. But something had shifted inside him. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was trying to uncover something buried, something important. And it was more than financial now. It was personal. By the time Owen arrived, a weathered man in a patched flight jacket, silver hair flattened by his old aviation cap, the kids had already started calling the plane the Ghost. They had no better name for it, and something about its presence in that hangar, silent and perfect, felt spectral. "Well, well," Owen muttered, stepping through the hangar's threshold. "You weren't kidding." He walked around the aircraft without speaking again for a solid 10 minutes. He examined the wings, ducked under the fuselage, tapped on the control surfaces with his knuckles. Then he looked at Joseph, his face unreadable. "Where did you say you found this?" Joseph shrugged. "Didn't. It was just here, locked away, forgotten." Owen knelt by the left engine cowling and ran a finger across the metal. "This is handmade, not custom, handmade, like one-off tooling, formed with jigs, maybe even hammer-molded. And look at these intake ports. You see that? Joseph leaned in. That shouldn't be here, Owen continued, shaking his head. No aircraft in 48 had intake shaping like that. This is advanced, way advanced. They spent the entire day in the hangar. Joseph deferred to Owen's experience, soaking up every observation, every theory. By the end, they had compiled a list of features that simply didn't make sense for the year engraved on the brass plate. Owen's conclusion was simple and unnerving. Either this plane's a modern replica built with retro parts, which I doubt, or it was built by someone with knowledge decades ahead of their time. Lily piped up from the cockpit ladder, where she'd been eavesdropping. So, what, like time travel? She laughed, but Owen didn't smile. No, he said, just genius. That night, around Joseph's kitchen table, with mugs of reheated coffee and the smell of burnt toast still lingering in the air, they tried to piece it together. Mason pulled out the tablet, displaying the earliest reference he'd found to a Charles Mercer, a name that fit the initials CM, an engineer who had briefly worked with the War Department in the 1940s before disappearing from public record. There were no patents in his name, no confirmed designs, just a trail that stopped cold in 1948, right around the time the Ghost would have been assembled. Owen's brow furrowed as he read. I remember that name, he said. There were rumors about a guy back in the day. Mercer, yeah. Some said he was working on a hybrid propulsion concept, experimental fuels, nothing concrete, just bar talk and faded clippings. Joseph leaned forward. You think this is his plane? Owen didn't answer. He just looked down at the brass plate photo Mason had taken and tapped a finger once against the initials. I think if it is, we just uncovered something that's going to turn a lot of heads. The question is, whose? The next day, Joseph made a decision. They would begin full documentation. Every part, every marking, every inch of metal would be recorded, not just because it might be valuable, but because someone, someday, would want proof of what they'd found. Proof it was real. He borrowed a high-end camera from his old college roommate. Mason took the lead on the visuals. Lily took on the logbooks, sketching the plane from angles she said helped her understand how it wanted to fly. Owen, surprisingly, stayed longer than expected. He cancelled a few commitments back in Minot, muttering something about how real history doesn't wait. And slowly, deliberately, piece by piece, they began to rebuild a legend no one knew existed. Not for fame, not even for money, but because some machines were too important to stay buried, because some stories, no matter how lost, were worth bringing back to life, and because sometimes fixing something old doesn't just preserve the past, it heals the present. The frost on the inside of the hangar windows hadn't fully melted when Joseph sat down with a worn notebook and a calculator. He didn't need to do the math to know what the answer would be. He already felt it in his gut. But numbers had a way of stripping hope down to facts, and this morning he needed facts. The sheet of figures in front of him read like a slow-motion collapse. The mortgage was 27 days overdue, the utility bill had a red stamp across it, and his shop's bank account had less than $400 to its name. The contract work had dried up when the regional commuter service moved maintenance operations to Sioux Falls, and the few private planes in Hartwell hadn't needed much more than oil changes and brake checks since fall. If he didn't find $8,000 by the end of the month, the bank would begin foreclosure, not just on the shop, but on the house too. He stared at the last line on the paper. Loan deferred, denied. That had been his last attempt to buy time, a personal visit to the bank manager, Stephen Bradley, whose kids went to school with Lily and Mason. Stephen had listened, nodded, offered that patronizing, tight-lipped banker smile, and said his hands were tied. Joseph had left that meeting with a hollow feeling and a headache he couldn't shake. He sat back in the kitchen chair and rubbed his face with both hands, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant thud of Mason's footsteps overhead. The house was still asleep, the kind of silence he used to cherish, when Grace would be curled up on the sofa with a book and a blanket, and the kids were toddlers giggling in their sleep. Now that same silence felt heavy, like it was waiting for bad news. Later that morning, as the kids bundled into jackets for school, Lily noticed the envelope on the kitchen counter, the one from Community Bank, unopened. She didn't say anything, but her eyes lingered on it. Joseph caught the glance. He forced a smile. Just bills, nothing interesting. Mason raised an eyebrow but didn't press. They were old enough now to understand the look in their father's eyes, old enough to know when he was trying to protect them. After dropping them off, Joseph headed back to the hangar, more out of instinct than strategy. He hadn't figured out what to do about the money, but he couldn't just sit in the house waiting for the walls to cave in. The moment he stepped into the hangar, the cold air snapped at his face, and the smell of old oil and oxidized metal grounded him in a way numbers never could. The plane was there, as it had been every day since they uncovered it, silent and still, waiting. And somehow it made him feel less alone. Owen was already there, bundled in his old flight jacket, working on a makeshift test of the hydraulic system. "You look like hell," he said without looking up. "Did the bank finally decide to pull the trigger?" Joseph didn't answer right away. He walked over to the toolbox, opened the top drawer, and stared at the socket wrenches like they held the solution to his life. "They gave me a deadline," he said finally. 4 weeks. I've got 3 left now. After that, we lose everything." Owen set his tools down and exhaled slowly. "You know, most guys in your situation would have already sold this plane off to the first collector who came sniffing around." Joseph didn't even look up. "No one's sniffing. Not yet. And I'm not going to sell it to the wrong person just because I'm desperate. Even if it means losing the roof over your head, especially if it means that." There was a long silence between them before Owen finally nodded. "Then let's figure out another way." They spent the rest of the morning not working on the plane, but mapping out what Joseph later called the Hail Mary plan. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even likely, but it was something. Mason had mentioned a local aviation club, the Dakota Wing, made up of hobbyists, retired engineers, and warbird restoration fanatics. If anyone had leads on collectors or preservation grants, it would be them. Owen still had contacts from his Air Force days. He offered to call a guy in Kansas who now worked at a museum. Joseph called Richard Morrison at the airport office and asked if they could use the municipal boardroom for a community aviation outreach meeting, and Richard, bless him, said yes without asking too many questions. That evening, Joseph sat the kids down at the dinner table and laid it out. Not everything, not the foreclosure, not the exact number in the bank, but enough. He told them they were running out of time, that the only way to save the plane, the shop, and maybe even the town's little airport was to turn what they'd found into a story people cared about. "We've got 3 weeks, he said, to convince someone, anyone, that this aircraft is worth saving, because if we can prove its historical value, maybe we can access grants, get a museum involved, get it under protection, but we can't do it alone." Mason leaned back, arms folded, thinking it through. "We're not just fixing a plane," he said. "We're launching a campaign." Lily grinned. "Then we'll need a name, something better than the Ghost." By the next morning, Mason had built a simple web page titled Project CM. He included photos, technical write-ups, and a bullet point list of anomalies and advanced features. Lily began designing flyers for the Dakota Wing event, and Joseph drafted an email to every contact he'd ever made in 20 years of aviation work, explaining what they'd found and inviting them to come see it with their own eyes. No hard sell, just facts, and a photo of the brass plate built for the sky, grounded by love. $1,048,048. They didn't know it yet, but those 5 words would become the rallying cry that changed everything. It started with a knock at the shop door just after dusk. Joseph had been closing up, sweeping the floor of the main bay with the kind of exhausted rhythm that comes from a long day of pretending everything's fine. When he opened the door, the cold wind swept in first, Then the man behind it, a stocky, red-cheeked stranger in a wool coat and felt hat that had seen better decades. He introduced himself as Walter Davis, former airframe technician and president emeritus of the Dakota Wing Aviation Club. He held one of the flyers Mason had designed, folded 3 times but still clearly legible. "I read your note," Walter said, his voice gravelly and slow. "You weren't joking about this plane?" Joseph ushered him into the office, pulled out the folder of printed photos, and explained everything from the moment he opened that hangar to the first time Owen said the word prototype. Walter listened without interrupting, occasionally adjusting his glasses as he flipped through each image. After a long pause, he simply said, "If this is what you say it is, you've got something important. Maybe something lost. I'll get some eyes on it." By the next afternoon, the hangar was full. At first, it was just Walter and a few of the club members, retired mechanics, part-time pilots, and history buffs who showed up out of curiosity. But by midweek, word had spread. A couple of local reporters dropped by, then a college student from Pierre who was working on a thesis about post-war aviation innovation. By Friday, the Kansas Museum contact Owen had reached out to finally responded, not with a polite decline, but with a promise to visit the following Tuesday. "Your photos," the man wrote, "show airframe work that doesn't match anything in the public record from 1948. If authentic, this could be a major find." With every visitor came more questions, more theories, more nervous energy. Joseph was spending hours giving the same tour, telling the same story, answering the same question. "What do you think it's worth?" He didn't know how to answer that. How do you put a price on something that might not just be rare, but unique? A piece of engineering no one had documented, tied to a name barely mentioned in history books, sealed in a hangar like a time capsule. And yet, the real shift didn't happen because of the technical specs or the mystery. It happened because of the story. That brass plate, the inscription, built for the sky, grounded by love. Walter said it reminded him of the pilots he served with in Korea, men who risked everything to fly, but never stopped writing home to the women they loved. A younger mechanic, in his 20s, stood silent for 10 minutes staring at the cockpit, then said his grandfather used to sketch planes just like this in the margins of his notebooks after the war. Mason noticed it first. People didn't just want to see the aircraft. They wanted to connect with it. That weekend, Joseph held an open house at the hangar. He borrowed space heaters and set out folding chairs. Lily baked cookies. Mason gave tours. They didn't charge admission, just asked people to sign a guestbook and leave a comment if they had thoughts. By the end of the day, 3 pages were full. Some were simple, beautiful craftsmanship. Others were personal. "Reminds me of my father's service stories." One note stood out in particular, scrawled in flowing cursive by a visitor named Anna Kensington. "This is Mansfield's work. I'd bet my late husband's wings on it." Joseph nearly dropped the book when he read that name. Mansfield. He called her the next morning. Anna had been married to Edward Kensington, a military test pilot from the 1950s who, according to her, once flew with Charles Mansfield, or someone who went by that name. They'd met during a classified program near Fort Riley. Ed never said much, she explained, but he always carried a sketch in his flight log of a strange aircraft, sleek like a bullet, with swept wings and some kind of hybrid power system. "I only ever saw it once. When he passed, I donated his things to a university archive, but I swear the plane in your photos matches that drawing." Joseph's mind was racing by the time he hung up. He called Owen, relayed the story, then went digging through university archives online. Mason helped him search for Kensington's donation. It took 4 hours and 3 phone calls, but they found it, buried in the catalog at Eastern Kansas Tech. And there it was, one scan of a hand-drawn side profile, dated 1950. The silhouette was unmistakable. The ghost, the plane in their hangar. They were no longer guessing now. They were tracing a bloodline. Real evidence, real names, real threads in the tapestry of forgotten aviation history. And for the first time, Joseph realized they might actually be ahead of the clock, not just in terms of money or deadlines, but in telling a story the world had nearly lost. That night, he stood in the hangar alone after the kids had gone home, staring at the prototype like it might start speaking. He felt something swelling in his chest that had nothing to do with pride or anxiety. It was belief, the kind he hadn't let himself feel since before Grace passed, the kind that felt like building something that mattered. They weren't just restoring a machine, they were recovering a dream, and in 3 short weeks, that dream had become a movement. The wind had shifted by morning, carrying with it the heavy stillness that always came before a snowstorm. Joseph stood outside the hangar with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a set of blueprints in the other, watching the grey sky press lower and lower over Hartwell. Everything felt paused, like the whole town was holding its breath. But inside Hangar 5, nothing was still. For the past 5 days, the place had become a hive of purposeful chaos. Tables were covered with schematics. Every corner was stacked with crates of supplies, borrowed equipment, tool chests, notebooks, and bundles of wires labeled in Mason's meticulous handwriting. What had started as a salvage effort had become a full-scale restoration campaign, fueled by adrenaline, desperation, and something more intangible, momentum. The day after Anna Kensington's revelation, Joseph had driven to Sioux Falls to meet a university curator who'd managed the archive donation from her late husband. He returned with a scan of Edward Kensington's personal sketchbook and a signed affidavit confirming that the aircraft documented in those pages matched what sat in Joseph's hangar. With that, they had something more powerful than guesswork. They had provenance. That same evening, Dr. Hal Brenner, a retired aerospace historian from the University of Kansas, called after receiving an email forwarded from Mason's outreach list. He had one question. "Has anyone documented the serial engraving yet?" Joseph snapped a photo immediately. Under the pilot seat, etched into the main spar of the fuselage, CM4701. Brenner's voice cracked when Joseph read it aloud. "That's Mansfield's designation system. He only used it on 3 airframes, the one that crashed during testing, the one the military seized, and the prototype that disappeared." He paused. "That would make yours the 3rd. By the end of the week, everything had changed. The local newspaper ran a story that exploded beyond their quiet corner of South Dakota. A regional news affiliate picked it up next, then a podcast. A clip of Lily explaining the plane's unusual control system in her unfiltered teenage enthusiasm went mildly viral. And just like that, they weren't just restoring an aircraft, they were curators of a mystery that had pulled in everyone from aviation buffs to amateur historians. Calls came in non-stop. A man in Oregon claimed to have worked on Mansfield's early blueprints. A woman in Ohio remembered her grandfather talking about a secret hangar where the future was being built with rivets and hope. One by one, the puzzle pieces drifted in from across the country, fragments of a forgotten legacy landing right in Joseph's hands. But the attention came with pressure, deadlines, eyes, expectations. The Kansas Aviation Museum confirmed a team would be arriving to assist with documentation and early-stage restoration. Joseph would need to prepare structural assessments, component verification, and access logs. Meanwhile, the grant proposal was gaining traction. David Harrington, now fully aligned with the Clarks' efforts after publicly opposing his father's development plan, offered his background in economic development to help prepare a funding case. His connections had already opened doors at 2 private foundations, one of which promised to expedite the review process if a third-party verification came through within 10 days. Joseph knew what that meant. They had 1 week to turn a cold, dusty hangar into a working restoration facility. So they got to work. Joseph called in every favor he'd ever earned. Richard Morrison arranged for electricity upgrades to the hangar. Owen lent them a heavy-duty compressor and 2 engine stands from his own workshop. A retired sheet metal tech named Barry showed up with his son and a TIG welder, and within hours he was making delicate aluminum repairs like he hadn't missed a day since retiring in '97. Violet became the unofficial crew chief, directing volunteers with a natural authority no one questioned. Her diagrams were cleaner than most professionals. She took measurements, inspected cables, and even fabricated a mounting bracket from spare parts when the original was deemed unsafe. Mason stayed behind a laptop for hours at a time, coordinating outreach, cataloging inventory, and building a digital log that would later become a key part of the grant submission. Everyone gave what they could: time, tools, ideas. But Joseph gave everything. He worked 16-hour days without complaint, fueled by coffee and that quiet, stubborn fire that had carried him through loss and loneliness for 3 years. He made calls to regional museums, to veterans groups, to preservation boards. He stayed up late translating Mansfield's surviving notes, scribbled in a mix of shorthand and technical jargon that only a mechanic could fully appreciate. And all the while, the question circled his thoughts like a vulture. Would it be enough? Then came the letter. It arrived without ceremony. Just a plain white envelope slid through the shop door early one morning. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, headed with an embossed gold emblem and a name that made Joseph sit down where he stood. Helen Mansfield, the widow, still alive, still watching, still searching. The letter was short and direct. She'd heard about the discovery. Her representatives would be visiting in 3 days, and she wanted to see the aircraft for herself, in person, soon. Joseph stared at the page, heart pounding. It wasn't just the confirmation that she existed, it was the fact that she cared, that the story meant something to someone other than his kids, the historians, or the mechanics. This was personal now. That night they stayed in the hangar long after dark. Joseph installed new lighting. Violet finished wiring the refurbished instrument panel. Mason updated the website with a new entry. "Mrs. Mansfield is coming." Underneath, he wrote a single sentence that would echo through the project for days to come. "Let's make sure she sees what he left behind." And so, with the snow now threatening to fall and the hangar glowing like a cathedral in the dusk, Joseph took one last walk around the prototype. He touched the wing, cool and clean beneath his hand. He felt the vibrations of tools still buzzing in the back. He heard Lily's laughter echo from the office where she was organizing parts labels, and the distant murmur of Owen arguing with Barry about torque specifications. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was a promise. To the man who built it, to the woman who lost him, to the kids who believed when no one else did. The aircraft had been asleep for nearly 8 decades. Now it was finally waking up. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Joseph Clark stepped into Hangar 5, the crunch of frost under his boots echoing softly in the still morning. Inside, the space glowed with the low hum of halogen lamps and the scent of metal, oil, and old ambition. He paused at the threshold, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Today wasn't like the others. Today, she was coming. Helen Mansfield, the woman whose name had hovered around this project like an echo, growing louder with each new discovery, each thread they pulled from the fabric of history. The woman who had once loved a man who vanished into blue sky and legend. The woman who, through one letter, had shifted the entire course of this small-town restoration effort into something larger, something irreversible. For days leading up to her arrival, the entire town of Hartwell had been buzzing with anticipation. The mayor had quietly pushed back the council vote on Harrington's airport acquisition to allow new developments to be formally presented. Betty Williams from the council had dropped by to look at the aircraft herself, tears welling in her eyes when she saw the brass plate. Meanwhile, David Harrington had been working with Blake on organizing a formal preservation proposal, and Violet had written an 8-page report detailing the restoration timeline. Even Mason, who had barely slept, was now assembling an archive-quality presentation for the Smithsonian and drafting talking points for the press. But beneath all the effort and late nights and anxious logistics, one truth remained clear. This wasn't just about saving the hangar anymore. This was about honoring the life and legacy of a man whose genius had been forgotten by time and whose memory had lived on only in the margins of journals, faded photos, and a grieving widow's heart. Helen Mansfield arrived precisely at 10, just as she said she would. The black sedan eased through the open gate and pulled up in front of the hangar with the quiet confidence of old money and well-kept secrets. Joseph stepped forward, adjusting the collar of his flannel shirt, his palms cold despite the gloves. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who carried her years with an air of command, honed through decades of boardrooms, negotiations, and solitude. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her dark coat heavy and elegant, but it was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and deeply burdened, that told Joseph everything he needed to know. She wasn't here for a show. She was here to find a piece of her life she'd been missing for 75 years. Beside her was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, holding a tablet and a leather-bound notebook. Helen introduced her granddaughter, Sarah, with the kind of quiet pride reserved for legacies passed not through money, but meaning. "She's studying aviation history," Helen explained. "She's the one who found your article and recognized the plate inscription." Sarah offered a shy but eager smile. "It was in one of my grandfather's letters to her. The phrase, 'built for the sky, grounded by love.' He wrote it just before he disappeared. She's kept it framed by her desk ever since." Joseph led them inside, heart pounding with a mixture of pressure and responsibility he could barely describe. The hangar was immaculate, swept, polished, organized like a museum, but still breathing with life. The aircraft stood in the center, partially restored, but unmistakably magnificent. Every person in the room had paused their work, standing at a respectful distance, waiting for Helen to take her first look. And when she did, silence fell like snow. She walked toward the plane slowly, almost as if in a dream, her hand reaching out to trace the curve of the wingtip with a trembling grace that said more than words ever could. Helen didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Then, softly, she whispered, "It's him. It's Charles." Joseph felt the air change. This wasn't about engineering anymore. This was about grief and love and the kind of quiet that comes when you find something you never expected to see again. Violet stepped forward then, respectfully but confidently. "Would you like to see the inscription?" Helen nodded, and Violet guided her to the cockpit, pointing to the small brass plate mounted just below the throttle. Helen read it, touched it, and closed her eyes. "I remember him working on this. He called it his second skin, said it would fly faster and cleaner than anything before it, but he never got to finish it. They wanted him for the military version. He was going to come back to this one after. He never did." Sarah stood beside her, flipping through her notes, showing Violet a copy of a blueprint her grandfather had sketched in pencil on hotel stationery. Violet immediately recognized the airframe shape, the same unique blend of swept-back wings and narrow tail that had puzzled their engineers. Sarah looked up. He wasn't just designing for performance. He was building a new method of fuel regulation, a system that was too advanced for his time. That's what made it dangerous. Joseph stepped forward then. "We've seen signs of it, innovations built into the engine housing, things that wouldn't become mainstream for another 30 years. Whoever Charles was, he wasn't just a pilot. He was a visionary." Helen's gaze didn't waver. He was more than that. He was a man who wanted to change the world and still come home in time for dinner. He wrote me letters from airfields, napkins full of equations, and poems about our daughter. I told him to chase the sky, but never forget the ground. He promised he wouldn't. They stood like that for a long while, all of them wrapped in the weight of memory and possibility. When the mayor arrived with the council to formally evaluate the site, Helen didn't leave. Instead, she turned to Joseph and asked one simple question. "What's your plan?" Joseph walked her through it, the restoration timeline, the grant applications, the proposed aviation heritage center that would preserve the aircraft, educate future engineers, and serve as an economic engine for Hartwell. He showed her the schematics Violet had drawn, the digital archive Mason had assembled, the event outreach plan Blake had written by hand and revised twice before showing it to anyone. Helen listened, asked sharp questions, and then surprised everyone when she turned to the council and said, "If you approve this center, I will match every dollar they raise, personally." A ripple moved through the hangar. The mayor blinked. "You mean you're funding the restoration?" "I'm investing in the legacy of a man who gave everything he had for a dream," Helen said, "and in the family that pulled that dream back from the edge of history." The council left with stunned faces and shaking heads. Harrington was nowhere to be seen. That night, Joseph sat at the edge of his bed with the envelope still in his hands, the agreement Helen had drawn up. Her personal lawyer would oversee the trust. The Charles Mansfield Aviation Innovation Fund. The restoration would be fully supported. The Heritage Center would break ground in spring. The Clark family would lead the board, and Hartwell would never be the same. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Inside the hangar, the prototype gleamed beneath soft work lights, surrounded by sketches, notes, and the breath of a dream rekindled. The plane had been grounded by love, but now it was ready to fly again. And for the first time in years, so was Joseph. The town of Hartwell had always lived slow, its rhythms measured by crop seasons, dusty windshields, and the quiet groan of prairie winters. But as the first week of December arrived, something had shifted. It wasn't just the lights being strung along Main Street earlier than usual, or the holiday window displays with their decades-old decorations. It was something deeper, an energy, a current running just beneath the surface, invisible but unmistakable. People talked about it over pie at Prairie Rose Diner. At the gas station, behind the register, Edna kept a photo of the Mansfield prototype tacked beside her lottery display. Teachers were assigning projects about local history, and for the first time in recent memory, students weren't groaning about it. The Clarks had become the unlikely center of a story that was no longer theirs alone. The aircraft in Hangar 5 had stopped being a curiosity. It had become a symbol, and symbols have gravity. Joseph was up by 4:45 every morning. He couldn't sleep even if he wanted to. The restoration had moved past its delicate inspection phase and into careful action. The fuel lines had been flushed and replaced, the landing gear inspected and stabilized, and Violet, ever the natural mechanic, had taken charge of reassembling the control surfaces with a focus and calm that stunned even the seasoned technicians visiting from the Kansas Aviation Museum. She had developed a rhythm, her hands coated in protective gloves, her tools set out the same way every day, her playlist running in the background, an eclectic mix of classic rock and acoustic guitar that somehow made the hangar feel less like a workspace and more like a place where history healed. Blake, meanwhile, had turned a corner. Once hesitant to step out of the back office role, he now met regularly with town officials, grant representatives, and even a Smithsonian liaison who was guiding them through the complex maze of federal preservation status. He had mastered the numbers, the budgets, the timelines, the cost estimates. But more than that, he'd become a quiet force of clarity in moments when Joseph felt overwhelmed. At just 14, Blake was already acting like someone who saw further ahead than most adults. He kept a whiteboard in the corner of the hangar listing key tasks, target dates, and grant deadlines, updating it every night before they locked up. But even with all the progress, the shadow of the council vote loomed large. Only a few days remained. Harrington hadn't disappeared. If anything, he'd become more dangerous in his silence. Rumors swirled that he was lobbying the council privately, that he was offering incentives to sway votes, that he had arranged for a site inspection by a state development board that would declare the airport underutilized, opening the door for eminent domain. Joseph knew he couldn't control what happened in backroom meetings or whisper campaigns, but he could control what happened in that hangar. On the third day of the month, just before sunset, something remarkable happened. Helen Mansfield returned. She hadn't said she would. She hadn't scheduled it. She just arrived, alone, in a rental car, with a heavy coat and her granddaughter's leather-bound journal clutched to her chest. Joseph met her at the hangar door with the warmth of someone seeing not just a benefactor, but a part of the family. They spoke little at first. She walked the perimeter of the aircraft, eyes scanning the freshly restored sections with approval. When she stopped near the nose, her voice was soft, almost fragile. "This is further along than I thought it would be," she said. "Charles always said a good restoration is just a love story with blueprints." Joseph smiled at that, not because the words were sentimental, but because they were true. Every bolt they'd replaced, every wire they'd run, every decision they'd made had come from the same place. Not pride, not even legacy, but love, for craftsmanship, for stories, for the belief that some things are worth fixing. They talked then, at length, about the institute Helen wanted to build, not just a museum, but a living center for young innovators to learn, fail, try again. She envisioned workshops, scholarships, mentorships. She wanted to create a place where the next Charles Mansfield could discover their calling without having to leave their small town behind. She spoke with the focus of someone who had already built empires, but the tenderness of a woman who had lived long enough to know what truly lasts. Joseph asked her the question he'd been holding back for weeks. Why now, after all this time? Helen paused, her eyes settling on the wingtip where Violet had engraved the original part number by hand. "Because something told me to stop looking backward and start investing in what's ahead. You and your kids didn't find this plane just to restore metal. You found it to restore memory. That matters." As if on cue, Violet entered the hangar, unaware of the conversation. She was covered in grease again, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back in a way that mirrored her mother's photo on Joseph's desk at home. She froze when she saw Helen, wiping her hands quickly on a rag. "I didn't know you were coming today, ma'am." Helen gave a small, warm nod. "I came to see the future." The next morning, news broke that changed everything. The State Historical Commission had issued a provisional ruling in response to David Harrington's expedited request. The aircraft and the hangar had sufficient historical and cultural significance to be protected from demolition or commercial redevelopment until a full review could be conducted. Harrington's bid was effectively paused, maybe even dead. The mayor scheduled a public hearing for the following day. Word spread like wildfire. By afternoon, the hangar was full of visitors, neighbors, reporters, families, a class from the local high school, former pilots and curious tourists. Joseph watched as Violet walked a group of kids through the cockpit features, explaining airflow and control surfaces like she'd been doing it her whole life. Blake was giving a presentation at a folding table using his charts and a laptop linked to the hangar's old projector. Someone brought donuts. Someone else brought coffee. At one point, Joseph just stood still, trying to take it in. They had built a restoration site, but what it had become was something else entirely. A gathering place, a beacon, proof that small towns still had stories to tell and people willing to tell them. That night, as the last visitors left and the hangar settled into quiet once again, Joseph stood at the foot of the prototype and looked up. The ceiling lights reflected off the polished aluminum, casting glints across the curved body like constellations. He felt something rise in his chest, not pride exactly, not relief, just purpose, a quiet knowing. Tomorrow the town would gather for the hearing. Tomorrow the votes would be cast. But tonight, standing beside a machine built by hands long gone and saved by hands still learning, Joseph Clark knew one thing for certain. No matter what the council decided, they had already won something far greater than any motion on paper. They had built a future. The morning of the vote arrived draped in heavy fog, the kind that silenced the town of Hartwell like a reverent pause. Main Street was quiet, but not still. There was an undercurrent of movement, early risers scraping frost from windshields, cafe doors creaking open, and voices murmuring about the council meeting scheduled for 6 p.m. at the town hall. The final decision on the airport's fate was no longer just a procedural step. It had become a line drawn in the sand, between two versions of the future, one paved with concrete and chain stores, the other built from memory, craftsmanship, and quiet defiance. Word had spread fast, not just locally, but regionally. Newspapers, bloggers, even a news crew from Rapid City had sent a van. The town hadn't seen this much attention since the flood of '89, and this time the tide wasn't water, it was history. Joseph stood alone in Hangar 5 just after sunrise, sipping coffee gone cold as he watched his breath rise in the chilly air. Around him, everything was ready. The Mansfield prototype sat polished and resplendent, draped in soft lighting, surrounded by easels and placards explaining the engineering breakthroughs hidden beneath its gleaming surface. Violet's diagrams, Blake's research boards, and Helen's donation agreement were all arranged like exhibits in a traveling museum. But this wasn't a museum. This was a statement that something beautiful had been built here by a father and his children, in a hangar that had been forgotten by progress until someone dared to believe in it again. By mid-morning, the hangar began to fill, not with noise but with purpose. Volunteers streamed in to help polish glass, organize pamphlets, and set up chairs for visitors who wanted one last look before the vote. Violet worked tirelessly under the fuselage, rechecking torque values and verifying tension lines. She said it calmed her nerves. Blake was on the phone, finalizing digital presentations with David Harrington, who had become something of an unofficial strategist. David had brought in a small team of interns from his old university program to draft a revised museum plan overnight, incorporating feedback from the town council's preliminary questions. No one slept much. No one wanted to. This was what the edge of history felt like. Helen Mansfield arrived just before lunch, walking softly with a cane, but dressed in her signature style, tailored wool, classic lines, nothing frivolous. Amanda Foster trailed behind, carrying folders of legal documents and financial statements, but Helen wasn't there for bureaucracy. She was there for the fight. And when she looked Joseph in the eye and said, "You've already won, whether they know it or not," he believed her. She spent an hour walking the hangar, not just as an observer, but as a witness. She asked Violet questions about the restoration process, complimented Blake's meticulous documentation, and stood silently in front of the brass plate for several long minutes. She touched it once, whispered something too soft for anyone to hear, then turned away with tears in her eyes. The hours passed like heartbeats. The council meeting was set for 6 p.m., and by 4:30, cars were already lining the streets. The town hall had never seen such a crowd. Farmers who hadn't been to a public meeting in years showed up in clean jeans and flannel. Kids from the high school arrived with notebooks and wide eyes. Business owners who once dismissed the airport as a relic now stood shoulder to shoulder with retired pilots and school teachers. The line to get inside curled around the building. The Mansfield prototype wasn't just an artifact anymore. It had become the center of something bigger, a town remembering who it was and imagining what it could still be. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was tense but electric. Mayor Hayes sat at the center of the long wooden table, flanked by 6 council members. Each had a binder in front of them. Each knew the weight of their decision. On one side of the aisle sat Anthony Harrington. Composed but visibly agitated, his proposal printed in glossy brochures, handed out with corporate precision. On the other side sat Joseph, Violet, Blake, Helen, Amanda, and David, supported by half the room and buoyed by nothing more than belief, evidence, and hope. The proceedings began with formalities, minutes from the last meeting, financial disclosures, legal parameters. Then came the proposals. Harrington spoke first, presenting his vision for a multi-use development, retail, housing, and a logistics hub. He cited data, projected tax revenue, and regional comparisons. It was polished, it was persuasive, it was hollow. When he finished, the silence was heavy, like a well-rehearsed pitch met with respectful indifference. Then Joseph stood. He didn't bring a speech, he brought truth. He spoke about his shop, his late wife, and the desperation that had once kept him awake at night, wondering how to make ends meet. He spoke of finding the plane, not as a lifeline but as a story buried in time that had asked to be told. He talked about the way his children had grown, how Violet had gone from curious helper to respected technician, how Blake had evolved from quiet calculator to leader. He described the engine, the innovations, the historical significance. But most of all, he described the town, not the town Harrington wanted to build, but the town that already existed, full of people who valued meaning over margins. Then came the final piece. Helen rose slowly, helped by Amanda, and addressed the council with a clarity that silenced the room. I am prepared to fund the Charles Mansfield Institute for Aviation Innovation to the tune of $2 million, with an operating endowment to follow, but only if the airport remains intact, only if this hangar and this story are preserved. I have built empires. I've sat in rooms with presidents and kings, but none of that compares to what you have here, a chance to choose history and to choose each other. She sat down, and the chamber held its breath. The council deliberated in a closed session that lasted 45 minutes. Outside, the crowd had overflowed onto the lawn, cell phones raised, faces pressed against glass. Joseph stood with his family, staring at the floor, hands folded, heart pounding. And when the doors finally reopened, when Mayor Hayes stood and cleared her throat, everyone knew the moment had come. The Hartwell Town Council, by a vote of 5-2, rejects the commercial development proposal for the Hartwell Regional Airport and formally accepts the preservation plan submitted by the Mansfield Institute for Aviation Innovation. The room erupted. Cheers burst from the back. People stood, hugging, crying, clapping, some chanting, "Hartwell lives." Harrington stormed out without a word, trailed by his assistants. But Joseph barely noticed. Violet had wrapped him in a hug so tight he couldn't breathe. Blake was shaking hands with reporters. Helen was crying openly. David smiled, wide, unguarded, victorious. Back at the hangar that night, long after the celebration had spilled into restaurants and porches, Joseph sat alone for a few minutes beside the prototype. The work wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. There would be contracts to sign, deadlines to meet, inspections, grants, construction, growth. But tonight, there was only peace, a stillness earned not by waiting, but by fighting for something that mattered. He looked at the nameplate again, built for the stars, grounded by love, and smiled. Not just because of what it meant for Charles Mansfield, but because now it meant something for him too, for Violet, for Blake, for Hartwell. Because sometimes the most extraordinary transformations don't happen in boardrooms or ballot boxes. Sometimes they begin with a broken-down aircraft in a forgotten hangar and a family that refuses to let it stay forgotten.